Hello and welcome to live programming at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we are going to be dealing with the issue of the new kerfluffle between Saudi Arabia and China. Today, the way we're going to handle things is I'm going to sort of riff on this for a half hour, hopefully not much longer than that. I've got a few points I want to get through that I want to talk about on this specific issue. And then when I'm done, I'm going to dive into the live chat and try to answer any questions that you guys might have, try to participate in that discussion. You guys are encouraged to talk to each other as I'm talking. But if you ask any questions during my initial presentation, I'm not going to be able to go back and find those questions again. I'm not very good at multitasking. So once we start the Q&A portion, if you could just remember your question and ask it again, then I'll be able to deal with it, and that would be great. So today we're going to be dealing with the issue of Saudi Arabia's recent diplomatic strife with Canada. This developed just over the past weekend. So first, a little bit of background. Saudi Arabia is probably one of the more enthusiastic human rights violators on the planet. There's anything you can think of, Saudi Arabia's does a fair amount of it, whether it's persecuting Shia minorities. They have public beheadings, which is not something that we're normally a big fan of. And they're huge on the crushing of internal dissent. This has always been the case, but things have changed as with many things in Saudi Arabia. Things have changed with this sort of new regime of King Salman and perhaps more importantly, Deputy Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. This is a guy who's known as MBS. He's the 30-something crown prince of Saudi Arabia, who's expected to be running the place for decades to come. He's sort of also seen as the force behind the throne of his father, King Salman, who's getting on in years and may not be as forceful as he once was. So what MBS has been doing has been consolidating his power. So it's this interesting balance where there's like a public relations push talking about how young, fresh MBS is bringing about a new, different Saudi Arabia. But at the same time, he's also crushing any dissent, anything that says that MBS isn't going fast enough, or actually, no, wait, there's all these issues that MBS isn't dealing with at all. So it's been a known quantity, something that we've looked at. Actually, honestly, I don't think we've delved into it too much on this channel, the way that MBS has this sort of two-stream policy where he's opening movie theaters. And I have talked about how amazing it was that he's talked about being not embarrassed, but trying to change course from Saudi Arabia's support for radical Islam. So he's got all that. But on the other hand, there's in some cases even more enthusiastic repression of human rights campaigners and activists, which of course doesn't even begin to get into the repression he's carrying out against members of his own family who might dispute his ability to take all the power that he's taken, which is kind of a revolution in Saudi society. So this is sort of the context here. On the other hand, we have Canada. Now, Canada is one of the happiest, shiniest countries. They really, really, really take human rights seriously. In the United States, in U.S. foreign policy, we claim to take human rights very seriously, but it's always secondary to our policies, our foreign policies. So human rights advocacy by the United States, well, it depends. Do we like this country or do we not like this country? If we like this country and it's perceived to be an ally, as Saudi Arabia is, we won't touch anything they do. I mean, maybe we'll have some State Department functionary sort of, in the distance, sort of hem and haw or issue a report or something like that. But it's not like our Secretary of State is going to get up and make a big stink about things. So Saudi Arabia has actually really been the big Achilles heel. I guess perhaps that's not it, but that's been the big, whenever anyone in the United States government tries to talk seriously about human rights anywhere in the world, the standard answer is and should be, well, what about Saudi Arabia, who you never do anything about? So Canada is not the world hegemon. Canada does have a really lamentable history with the indigenous peoples of North America, just as the United States does, but tries really, really hard. I can't speak to the effectiveness or the appropriateness of their efforts to make things up to the indigenous peoples of Canada, but the Canadian government sort of apologizes for that kind of activity. And other than that, they don't have a big history of imperializing or colonializing or this, that, and the other thing. So Canada's a very rich country, and human rights is a huge part of its foreign policy. Now, I don't want to say that's all that the Canadian foreign policy does. Absolutely not. It too functions for them as a cover for its business interests, for its, strategy or this, that, and the other thing. But Canada just has less that it has to focus on. I mean, its main foreign policy question generally is, to what degree are we going to agree with what the United States does? So in an effort to craft its own personality, Canada has historically been big on this human rights thing. I believe they're, at least historically, were large contributors to United Nations peacekeeping forces. They do a lot of grant making. They're human rights, woohoo, human rights and development. That's sort of what, at least how Canada sells its foreign policy apparatus and its defense capabilities, is that's what it does. So for quite some time, Canada was a little more serious about trying to be consistent with their human rights propagandizing. So they were not big fans of Saudi Arabia. This changed, I believe, about 3 years back under the last Prime Minister's administration, where Canada decided to get in on the arms race, the sort of defense industry bonanza as well. And they signed a $15 billion contract with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is going to buy, I believe, some light tanks or perhaps just heavy duty vehicles from a Canadian company. This, of course, is the main reason that the United States lets Saudi Arabia do whatever it wants, because whereas the Canadians have one $15 billion contract with Saudi Arabia, the U.S. has endless ongoing contracts for munitions. I think Trump went to Saudi Arabia last year and bragged about signing $100 billion worth of contracts in a single setting. That's just sort of one bunch of contracts. Now that was overblown. He was sort of taking credit for a lot of deals that were signed during the Obama years, and also for some commitments that weren't too firmed up. But it goes without saying that the Saudis buy a lot of weapons from the United States, and that's why they get a lot of deference from the United States as far as human rights stuff. So Canada sort of maybe 3 years ago started playing with this a little bit and decided to get into this sort of regime. And it seems like the no longer quite so new government of Justin Trudeau and his, I'm going to mispronounce her, Chrystia Freeland, I believe is the foreign minister of Canada, have, I think, perhaps decided they'd like to distance themselves from this attempt to get into the arms biz and more assertively put forward their human rights flag. I mean, the Trudeau's administration is more seen, as an American, everything in Canada looks like, socialism and left-wing progressive, this, that, and the other thing. But my sense is that, I don't know Canadian politics very well, is that Trudeau and his administration are seen as more left-leaning or center-left versus center-right, the administration that came before them. So they seem to be taking the human rights thing a little more seriously. And what happened this weekend, finally, was the Canadian Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, I believe, on her Twitter account, and I believe also in a speech, stood up for one jailed human rights activist in Saudi Arabia in particular. She was an advocate for Saudi women driving, among many other things. And this one story has actually, I think, caught a lot of people's attention because it's kind of absurd. There's this tremendous public relations push going on right now for the fact that Saudi Arabia has allowed women to drive. This is a huge news worldwide because Saudi Arabia is paying for it to be huge news worldwide. They're flying journalists to Saudi Arabia to see it. They're doing presentations. They're, putting together press packages. They've got hundreds of millions of dollars worth of public relations professionals in London, New York, and Washington, D.C., and Brussels, and heck, who knows, probably elsewhere as well, pushing this line very, very strongly. And it is absolutely a good thing that women in Saudi Arabia can drive now. Yay. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia is jailing the activists who helped to bring that about, which is stunningly hypocritical, and obviously something that the Trump administration isn't going to say anything about, because the Trump administration sort of stands for business over human rights, and has made a particularly large show of itself cozying up to Saudi Arabia. So they've been able to have a free hand pushing the Saudi Arabian government has been able to have a free hand in pushing this idea that, oh, look, women can drive now. Just pay no attention to the fact that we're arresting all the women activists who made that happen. So I believe it was last weekend, the foreign minister, both tweeted and in person, made an issue of this. A particular activist, Samar Badawi, who's recently been detained. There's other members of her family who've also been detained for long-term, for the longer term, and she made an issue out of it. And she requested that these and all human rights activists be released. And then also there was a Canadian government Twitter account that followed up with that. Now, what's interesting is the Saudi reaction to this, because this Canadian action is not that extreme, certainly by historical standards. And actually, I think I'll get into it a bit, how my opinion of this sort of revised overnight. I sort of outlined this last night, and I'm actually a little more sympathetic to Saudi Arabia now. I'm still not sympathetic to Saudi Arabia on this issue, but I think the general principle is kind of interesting. So this is something that predominantly white, more affluent countries have been doing all the time for quite some time. The United States, more in former administrations, Canada all the time, European countries all the time have this assumption that they should be the arbiters of human rights, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate in the world. And that's been unchallenged for quite some time. And it's a little messed up, actually. And I think in this case, I am definitely in full agreement with Canada's choice to call Saudi Arabia out here, and I think it's valuable and worth doing. But I do think that the Saudis have a very good point here, a very good broader point, not in what they're doing, which I think is wrong, but they do have a very good broader point here, which is like, why do you get to tell us what to do? There's I believe it's the International Criminal Court. I didn't, fresh my mind on this right now, but the International Criminal Court, which sits in Europe, yet exclusively prosecutes Africans. Once again, many who deserve it. But I think that's a very interesting dynamic here that we'll talk about a bit in the end. It's just that, yes, Saudi Arabia is the bad guys here, but they're kind of making a good point. So why is it exactly that all these rich white countries get to tell everybody what's human right and human wrong? I think that's a very interesting question, and we'll revisit that at the very end there. So what Saudi Arabia has done in response to what has been to this point a very normal thing for a rich white country to do, to sort of poo-poo the human rights actions of a not poorer in this case, but a browner country. Saudi Arabia has chosen to wildly overreact and has let's see, what's the list? The most. So there was a strongly worded comments from the various government Twitter accounts and whatnot, and that's That's expected. I think that's fairly standard. But they also, I believe, I get the minutia of this wrong. Yes, I believe they ejected the Canadian ambassador to Saudi Arabia, which is a very intense thing to do. This is something that Saudi Arabia does with disturbing frequency, but it's a very strong action to take. And they've also announced that on any new business with Canada will be sort of reviewed or possibly just stopped. And what I think strikes a lot of people as the most significant, but strikes me as a bit less significant, is it's differing things have been reported. I believe there's about 7,000 Saudi Arabian students in Canada that are there on Saudi government scholarships, and there are about 16,000 Saudi students in Canada total. So the Saudi government there's 16,000 students, and the Saudi government is paying for 7,000 of those. So I've gotten sort of differing stories on different places. I think we can say with great confidence that Saudi government has now discontinued those scholarships for those 7,000 students. That seems to be something that's definitely happening. And then it seems, I'm not sure, it's mostly just on Twitter. They may also be requesting that all 16,000 of those Saudi students in Canada be drawn back. And that's quite extreme. I don't think it's actually as painful to Canada as some think, because Canada is currently experiencing a massive influx of students that no longer want to go to the United States, because Trump has been very effectively scaring foreign students away from the United States. A lot of them go to Canada. So I don't think that really screws with. Well, actually, it does, because it's, the school year starts in a month. So I guess it really does screw with a few Canadian universities. So these are very extreme reactions. There was also, you might have seen on Twitter, but I think it's probably overdone. There was a graphic that was posted by a Saudi government account that appeared to show a plane flying into a building and having some kind of warning for the Canadian government or the Canadian people, from an old Arabic proverb. And I think that's pretty blown out of proportion. I think it was a stupid Saudi guy who, no, stupid that's a very loaded term. I shouldn't be name calling, but it was perhaps an unobservant lower level bureaucrat who thought he was making a clever analogy to, the Canadian ambassador being sent home. And not quite realizing that showing a plane flying towards the Toronto skyline might bring up some other associations, like, I don't know, 9/11. So that people have made a big deal about that, but I think it was quickly taken down, quickly apologized for, and I think the whole Twitter account was suspended. So I don't think that can be actually looked at as Saudi policy. What we've got now is kind of crazy enough, and I think. So just the students, the diplomat being sent back, and business being closed down. I think for both Saudi Arabia and Canada, what's interesting is I don't expect there to be much movement in either direction, because Canada and Saudi Arabia just don't have that much in the way of mutual business ties. I mean, it is something along the lines of it was $2 to $4 billion or something like that. And I'm sure there are individual business people in Saudi Arabia and Canada who are in deep water right now, and it's never a good thing for governments to do that to their businesses. But it's not a relationship like between Saudi Arabia and the United States. So I think Canada can sort of can use this to sort of burnish its human rights credibility and say, fine, you don't want our $15 billion worth of trucks, whatever, and can sort of stand on its human rights thing. And I believe Saudi Arabia can also stand on its sort of personal dignity, sovereignty thing as well. So I don't think things are really going to resolve between the two of them. I do expect the Canadian ambassador to return before too long, but I don't think this one's going to resolve either. But it definitely is part of a disturbing trend on the part of MBS and MBS's government. It's, I think, as I said, like as I sort of woke up this morning and was like, I think Saudi Arabia is actually kind of making a valid anti-imperialist point here. And I could see a lot of folks in Africa, Asia, South America being like, yeah, I mean, actually kind of identifying with this a bit. Like, you know what? Oh yeah, mind your own gosh darn business. Rich white folks who used to colonize us. Like I could see that having an appeal to it, but as with many things that MBS does that have some appeal to it, they're also part of about a million other things that have zero appeal to it. I believe it was last November when I made a video applauding him for being willing to move away from this stridently Wahhabist radical Islamic approach that the Saudi government has adopted for the past 30 years. It was last November, I made that video, and then literally the next day, he arrested half of his family, got the Lebanese prime minister, or was it, I can never remember if it's prime minister or president, to resign, forced a foreign prime minister to resign. So, I mean, it's like this guy has some great instincts, but he's also got a deep, deep well of crazy. And not just, I don't mean like personally crazy, I mean that the policies that he adopts are nuts. This is a guy who's trying to convince a lot of people to invest money in Saudi Arabia. As I've done with a whole series of videos on Saudi Arabia, I've talked about the way that the place is just running out of money and the way that oil markets look right now. It's not the fond old days where they could just buy everything, anything forever and nothing really mattered. And I'm not saying that Saudi Arabia is all of a sudden poor, but for MBS's own plans for the revitalization and diversification of Saudi Arabia to work, he needs very large foreign buy-in. He needs large investments from foreign companies, foreign countries, foreign multilateral banks, foreign everything. And to behave in the way that he does in the foreign policy arena is a real problem. And this sort of hissy fit over Canada, whereas if there was some other more stable country in Africa or the Middle East that was making this stand, I'd actually be pretty uncritically for it. Unfortunately, this particular kerfluffle comes as part of a long list of really kind of unbalanced and crazy things that are going to be terrible for Saudi investment, or sorry, for foreign investment into Saudi Arabia. You've got the Qatar crisis, which was pretty nuts. You've got the war in Yemen, which is incredibly expensive and yielding nothing for Saudi Arabia other than more bombs. There was Syria. Can't really pin the Saudi involvement in Syria on MBS himself. That predates him, but he definitely doubled down, and that had no positive effects either for Syria or for his supported factions in Syria. There was that incredible embarrassment of essentially kidnapping a political figure from Lebanon, forcing him to resign, and then having that figure go back to Lebanon and say, "Oh no, wait, I'm unresigned." It's just, this guy is not doing great. To bring up something else that we haven't heard about in the news for a while, doing research for this sort of cropped up. There's NEOM. There's that incredible megacity that's supposed to just sort of be built out of nothing at the cost of $500 billion, which is significantly larger than Saudi Arabia's foreign reserves at this point. I was talking about the way that Saudi Arabia isn't, broke, but is running out of money. Like, this project alone would wipe out all of their foreign reserves. And therefore, they need their foreign reserves for a few other things other than building magical megacities in the desert. So NEOM specifically, this was one of the things that was pitched last year as this brave new amazing thing. And one of the things they did was they hired a German guy, a very respected German businessman, to run it. I think he was the guy who used to run Siemens, which is a very big German conglomerate, to run NEOM. And this was a sign of seriousness. We've got this German guy here. This isn't just another King Abdullah technical city. This is something that's actually going to be built. This is something that's of real value. So in researching this, I wanted to look into another kerfluffle. It wasn't quite on the same level, but in November, Germany was the only, and Germany quite consistently, unlike the UK or France or the United States, that has a lot more irons in the fire in terms of arms manufacturing and contracts to Saudi Arabia. Germany is more willing to just come out and say Saudi Arabia is acting crazy. And they did that past November, and they've lost a lot of their the diplomats weren't sent home. Germany is a significantly bigger dog than Canada, or if not just a significantly bigger dog, also a significantly closer dog than Canada. So, their ambassadors weren't sent home or anything. But business has slowed down. So this very prestigious head of the NEOM megacity that's supposed to be built quietly resigned in July, because presumably what made him valuable was his connections to the German business world. But because MBS wants to do crazy things and wants to get angry about it when people call him out on the crazy destabilizing things he does, this really respected German businessman is really no longer all that useful. The story I read said that he's moved from being the head of NEOM to a sort of undefined advisor to the Saudi royal family, which just sort of generally on Saudi Arabia. I think it's finally, this channel has been saying for a couple of years now that the Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco IPO isn't going to happen. And it now seems over the past week or so, a lot of other people are conceding that as well. So a lot of these economic plan, and that's another thing, another casualty of MBS's dual nature. On the one hand, he's very good at appealing to certain elements of sort of world public opinion. My understanding is that he's very popular in Saudi Arabia. He's very popular in Saudi Arabia at this point. But as far as his actual policies in terms of foreign policy, business, what have you, it's undermining that sort of popularity, that very capably established public image is being undermined by the things that he actually does. So they were never able to line up the investors for the Aramco IPO. NEOM has quietly lost its distinguished German leader that was going to bring in all that foreign investment. I think there's more and more of this stuff that is just sort of built on sand, and I think people are beginning to get a sense of that, and that's problematic. I think one last thing. I think I've covered all the points that I wanted to cover. One last thing about this human rights thing, about the fact that Canada, I believe, is correct in this instance, and I believe the world should absolutely be condemning Saudi Arabia for its actions. There is something deeply weird about the way that international politics are set up right now, where we expect these sort of rich, white, generally formerly imperial countries to call people out on their human rights stuff. That's not. It's never been it's never been a good thing, but I think now more and more, as more and more countries in the global south, or as more and more countries that are not run by white people become rich and powerful, I think that's going to get harder and harder to take. So I think it's perhaps it's a sign that we need stronger institutions, sort of stronger international institutions that are willing to call out these sorts of activities. And I think maybe we already have that. Maybe we already have, because we do have a robust NGO architecture. And while I have a lot of trouble with, a Canadian or a German, or certainly a US or a French or a British government calling people out for human rights stuff, I don't have any trouble with Amnesty International or any of these other NGOs calling people out. So I don't know. I'm confused. Or what do you guys think? I mean, do you think it's perfectly fine for Canada, with its generally less imperial history, to run around telling people what's right and what's wrong? Because I think it's valuable. I think it's essential that countries like Saudi Arabia and the United States get called out. People do reports on the United States and the human rights violations that happen in U.S. prisons, U.S. criminal justice system. I mean, I've got a very long playlist on the evils of the U.S. criminal justice system, and I wouldn't have been able to do that if it weren't for NGOs, some international NGOs and some local NGOs that had put together. So NGOs, that's the sort of international way of talking about nonprofits for the American audience, for the U.S. audience. So yeah, I don't know. I'm a bit conflicted on this one, but that's my reaction to the Saudi Arabia Canada kerfluffle at this point. And I did it in a half hour. That's I'm quite proud of myself. Usually I go a little too long. So have we got questions? I can just do questions from here. So if you've asked questions further up, why don't you just repeat them now? We are now in the Q&A period. I can dive in here. That's Logo Cool Extreme launches it off with why is MBS such an incompetent moron? I think that's a little overstated. I go back and forth on sort of demonizing MBS. I think the system itself in Saudi Arabia, I think that's an interesting question, sort of like, who do we blame for what Saudi Arabia is? I think fundamentally, Saudi Arabia was set up by the British Empire and has been supported by the United States ever since FDR. So, who really, bears the blame for how, and I'm not saying that Saudis don't bear the blame, or that individual Saudi kings don't bear the blame, or that the Saudi government doesn't bear the blame. It's sort of important to realize that MBS, while he certainly looks like an incompetent moron, often is dealing with a set of circumstances that are very difficult to deal with. And I think MBS has some real gifts in terms of public relations, the ability. We have no idea what the minutia and the machinations and the nightmares of that MBS and his clique must be dealing with the Saudi royal family itself right now. I mean, there's been rumors, nothing that I felt confident enough to run with on this channel, but there's been rumors of actual physical fighting between factions in the Saudi royal family, like gun battles and stuff. So MBS is, while certainly I think overdoing, to me, as someone in the United States, I look at the list of incredible foreign policy failures that he's gotten Saudi Arabia into, and I say, yeah, he looks like a lunatic. Who is this schizophrenic dimbulb who is, telling the world, paying the world to tell everybody that he's, this new liberator, yet he's acting like some ridiculous 19th century European imperialist. Like, who is this guy? But we have to keep in mind that MBS isn't just playing to this audience, to this sort of, very international audience watching this YouTube channel, or, this, white guy sitting in Santa Fe, New Mexico, trying to make sense of things. I mean, he's got to appeal to the broader audience in the Arab world. He's got to appeal to the Saudi people, which he's apparently very good at appealing to the Saudi people. So he's got to look tough for the Saudi people. That's something that appeals to them. He's also got to appeal to the powerful people in Saudi Arabia and to his own family. So yeah, I mean, yes, I do agree that from our standpoint, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, looks nuts, but I don't know that we really appreciate how. I mean, the man lives Game of Thrones, and their Saudi kings have been assassinated in, palace coups. I think multiple. Is it just the one guy, or is it multiple times? killed by disgruntled family members. I know that's happened at least once. So, I mean, he's dealing with a very different world from any kind of other leader. And, it's not his fault that he was raised and born in this system. I think that was the initial point I was making in response to this question. I mean, it's the only reason we have these weird throwback monarchies up and down that coast there is because the British set them up, and then the US decided to maintain them. They would have fallen long, long ago if we, in the West hadn't decided we could get cheaper oil from medieval monarchs than we could get from Arab nationalists. So yeah, I mean, MBS strikes me as nuts, and I can see why it strikes Logo Cool Extreme as nuts. But we have to keep in mind that he's playing to many more audiences than just ourselves. Okay, what else we got in the questions? Have we got questions? Well, thank you. Avery Neal pointed out that it's rare that I managed to make it through the main program in just a half hour. So I'm pleased with myself, and I hope that you guys got something out of that. How long? Okay, Anglo-Saxon asks a very important question, which is how long will Saudi oil last? Now, this is important because there's a lot of misinformation going around about this. Also, some misinformation put out by the Saudis themselves. There's a lot of questions around how reliable the Saudi estimation of its reserves are. But my sense is that Aramco is a fairly well-run organization. While the Saudi reserves might be inflated to some degree, I don't think they're vastly inflated. So I actually think Saudi Arabian oil will never run out. But that's not enough to keep the Saudi government running. I think that's a crucial point that I perhaps should have made better in my Saudi Arabia is finished video last year. Saudi oil, what's important for the Saudi government and for the continuation of Saudi society on its terms isn't the fact that they're pumping oil. It's not that they're going to run out. What's important is that they can pump oil at a certain price point, because Saudi Arabia has the most cheaply producible oil in the world. There's the classic joke is you can just poke a straw into the ground and you'll get oil. It's very easy to get Saudi Arabian oil. So the break-even point for getting Saudi Arabian oil, per barrel out of the ground is something like $6 or $7. But the break-even point for the Saudi government, to be able to maintain itself at the current level of welfare spending and gold jet buying for the Saudi royal family, to be able to do that requires much, much more money. I think the IMF puts it at somewhere around $70, $80 a barrel or something like that. And basically the reason that Saudi Arabia is in such trouble is that the Brent price for a barrel of crude oil has just touched $72 a barrel. But of course, in order to do that, they've had to cut down the amount that they produce. So they're also losing money on that. For 4 years now, Saudi Arabia has been making nowhere near enough money to support its lifestyle as a government. So I believe that Saudi Arabia will be pumping oil long after every oil field in Texas is shuttered, long after they've forgotten that they had oil resources in Canada. Canada will still be pumping oil because, after the dawn of the electric cars and sun, there's a million things that are going to make us use less oil over the next 100 years. But, we're still going to need oil for plastic. We're still going to need oil for rocket fuel, probably. We're still going to need oil for a variety of applications. And Saudi Arabia will be the country that's producing that oil, but it's going to be at a much lower cost than it is in today. And the whole governing apparatus in Saudi Arabia that we're so familiar with, that we've been talking about for the past 45 minutes, will no longer exist. So yeah, Saudi oil will last functionally forever. The Saudi government, the current Saudi status quo, well, actually, the Saudi status quo as of when I made my Saudi Arabia is finished video a year ago is already gone, but it's going to change dramatically more, I would argue, over the next 10 years or so. So what is Kore Sejan Kuru asks, what is Saudi Arabia trying to do by liberating women? I think Saudi Arabia that's sort of a many-faceted question. I think Saudi Arabia acknowledges, I think a lot of MBS's appeal is his, and also King Abdullah as well, because I believe King Abdullah, the king before King Salman, was also very invested in attempting to do more for women. Of course, he was invested in that while at the same time dealing with a religious establishment that he supported fully that was very anti any progress for women. So I think the Saudi elite, the Saudi rulers have been conscious for a very long time that the role of women is a very serious problem for them. And as they look out into the future and begin to realize that they're not going to have this incredible oil benefit anymore, they're gonna have to start becoming more of a normal country, and treating women like people is sort of a key part of that. And they're nowhere near there yet, but they have been making real changes. And I think I should maybe run a video on that, because Saudi Arabia, I recently had a nice long lunch with a good friend of mine who lived in Saudi Arabia, and she agreed with me on most of my critiques and the problems, but she did point out that there are real changes happening in Saudi Arabia right now that I don't give enough credit to, or that I haven't thus far. The religious police, you've probably heard the horrific stories about the religious police and how they kept the women in, they wouldn't let women leave a burning school. They forced them to die rather than be out in public, like that sort of thing. The religious police under King Salman has been almost completely, they no longer have the ability to do what they do. They still exist, they're still around, but they're no longer allowed to harass people on the streets. Apparently, women are able to show their faces more now. People are able to meet men and women without being harassed. Now, this is, of course, just on the sort of top level of government involvement. What actually is going on in Saudi society and the kinds of powers that Saudi fathers and brothers have over the women in their family, I don't think really have changed much, though they have technically changed legally a bit. The guardianship laws have shifted a bit. My friend, in Saudi Arabia as a foreign, elite woman, had rights that I'm sure the vast majority of Saudi women do not have. We shouldn't overstate the amount of progress, but just the fact that there's no longer a religious police that can harass you and even beat you for not having the appropriate gear, or for not being, hanging out with the appropriate people, and that's tremendous progress. So we shouldn't undersell that. That is something that's happening, but it's just I would argue it's probably too little, too late for the sort of saving of Saudi Arabia as its current system, and also might in fact be inspiring a more radical reaction to MBS, because I'm not 100% I don't. People talk about MBS as if, oh, he could be president for the next 50 years, and I think physically he could, but I think the chances of him being president that long are slim. I think the chances of chances of MBS falling in some capacity in the next 5-10 years are pretty high. Okay, more questions. Yeah, Kurai Surgeon Kura, I don't think we'll be seeing gay marriage in Saudi Arabia anytime soon. Okay, Marshall H asks an interesting question. How can the U.S., Saudi Arabia, KSA, that's acronym for Saudi Arabia, Israel, be serious in supporting the MEK cult as a serious replacement of the Iranian regime? We talked about MEK, is it Mujahideen Khalq, a sort of quite nutty, quite crazy Iranian dissident group. We talked about that at length in the last live thing that I did a couple weeks back. That was, let me see if I can call up the name for that. I'm not as not as well versed with MEC as John Coombs, the guy we did. Oh yeah, The Economist is full of it on the F-35. There's a full discussion of Mujahideen-i-Khalq in that one, and I would suggest that you check that out because I am not as well versed on that group. I don't think anybody's really that serious in supporting MEC. I think that's where John came down on that one. I think that you just have a bunch of sort of spotlight greedy blowhards like Rudy Giuliani and John Bolton who will show up at their conferences. I don't know that anybody's gone into any great length supporting them. I think that would be insane. Okay, questions. Thoughts on Dr. Abdul El-Sayed in the Michigan gubernatorial race? Logo Cool Extreme asked if I have thoughts on Dr. Abdul El-Sayed in the Michigan gubernatorial race. I do not. I have not done any research on him. I would say I would be impressed. This is a sad commentary, but I would be impressed if someone with that name had a serious chance in the Michigan governor's race. I love Michigan, but I just don't think it's quite that far. It's interesting. I should look into this further because I have a lot of Michigan connections, and Michigan is it's just a fascinating place. I was up there for the 4th of July holiday. I go up there every year, and it's an interesting place. There's a bunch of it's a much more diverse place than many places in the Midwest. I was just in Missouri for my brother's wedding this past weekend, and that is not a diverse place. There's a lot of white people and some African Americans, but it's not diverse. Whereas Michigan is actually very diverse. There's a very long-standing Arab population. Dearborn, a city in the suburbs of Detroit, is very strongly Arab. It's Christian Arab, but it's a fascinating place. And who knows, Michigan, might be the first place with an Arab governor. But I'd be surprised if it happened this earlier. But I need to look into it further. Two things. So every 4th of July, I go to Northern Michigan, and we party with a bunch of 22-year-olds on a lake in Northern Michigan. It's called Torch Lake. And there were two things that I noticed that I thought were pretty cool. Because I've been doing this for about 16 years. And I remember 16 years ago, we'd go up there and my friends and I, who were always, at least in this fashion, more progressive leaning, would get very excited and sort of congratulate ourselves if there was a person of color up there. It's gotten much more diverse over the years since. But, it's gone from one person to maybe 1% of people, which is, not that great, but hey, it's Northern Michigan. What are you going to get? But one of the nice things this year was looking around on that sandbar where there's, 1 to 10,000 people looking around, and I did not see a single Confederate flag, which is the first time I have not seen a Confederate flag with a group of bunch of, rather very white, rather drunk rednecks. So I think that's progress, and I think that speaks to a lot of the stuff I've mentioned about Trump on this channel, the way that I think he's actually kind of killing a lot of the causes that he advocates. So that was kind of cool. And also what was very cool was there was the boat that pulled up right next to us, which is a bunch of kids from Dearborn. And they were partying with the rest of us, having a great time. But they also had a hookah. And I'm a big fan of tobacco out of the hookah. So I got to hit that as well and try some of my Arabic, which was fun. So anyway, I love Michigan. But I don't know enough about Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, and I'm sorry about that. John Hobbs asks, what is your opinion of takfiri? What is my opinion of takfiri? So I have talked a lot about Islamophobia from a geopolitical context, and I've actually kind of consciously avoided delving into a lot of this, Quranic exegesis, or I might mispronounce that, but this sort of getting to know the Quran in detail, or Muslim concepts, or this, that, and the other thing, mostly because it's so abused by sort of white dudes on YouTube. And this concept of takfiri, my understanding is it's this takfiri, is that the one where you're allowed to lie about what you believe? Oh, no, takfiri is the one where you treat other people as if they're not really Muslim or whatnot. I've found that the concepts, sort of Arabic concepts, are just so incredibly abused. Arabic Islamic concepts are so incredibly abused by sort of white guys on YouTube, named things like John Hobbs and Robert Morris, that I just don't delve into it. I think I would need to be an actual Quranic scholar, which none of the people talking about takfiri are, to actually talk about that at any length. But I will say that I think that whenever I have delved into concepts like this, I've found the description incredibly surface. There's a guy named Bill Warner, Dr. Bill Warner, who half the people who talk about takfiri in my comments are very familiar with, who is just an utter fraud. He's one of these guys who's a white guy from Tennessee or something, who's done a real serious analysis of the Quran, and in a very calm way, I've gone through and mathematically shown that Muslims are evil people with a terrible plan to take over the whole world. And I can't speak to his mathematical analysis of the Quran, which strikes me as ridiculous on its face. I mean, it's old, cobbled together poetry. Like, how seriously can you take anything in it? But I will say that his historical analysis is utter garbage, and I wrote a Quora post on that. It's just utterly ignorant twaddle. And some of his videos are about that. So generally speaking, if there's a white guy on YouTube talking about takfiri or any one of a number of other concepts, he's probably worth ignoring. So that's what I have to say about that. Okay, Cletus223 asks, do most Muslims in the Middle East, like in Turkey, just roll their eyes about women's rights, as in they think Western women are basically whores as they see it? That's an interesting question. I can't speak for most Muslims in the Middle East. Turkey has a serious, long-standing commitment to women's rights that also collides with a lot of cultural expectations as well. Just as the United States has a serious, long-standing commitment to women's rights that collides with the expectations and culture of the United States as well. I would say Turkey is, maybe 50 years behind the U.S. on these conversations. While at the same, it's weird because at the top level, and certainly at the lead level in Turkey, you've got a lot of commitment to the exact same sort of issues and approaches, and sometimes even more progressive than in the United States. I actually found the Turkish legal field is very heavily female. At all Turkish law firms, I worked at a Turkish law firm for a while. Most, not most, well, even most. I don't know. Well, I don't know. I was working in a particular fairly elite subset of Turkish law, but women are very heavily represented in the Turkish legal field. Of course, they're represented there because it's perceived that they'd have a much harder time being successful in the Turkish corporate world, which is very patriarchal, like the United States, the US corporate world, which is very patriarchal. So I think I think Cletus, I think you're trying to